2022 was one hell of a year for the UFC by any metric. Not only did it serve up a number of soon-to-be legendary fights, but it also birthed several stars who look set to dominate in the sport for years to come. But with an eye on 2023, it's time to look ahead to some of the possible fights that could well define the year for the UFC. Let's get into it. Alex Pereira vs Kamzat Chimaev. To kick things off, we have a fight that honestly might not even happen, but when you're a star of Kamzat Chimaev's stature, you can always rely on the UFC doing you a favor every now and again. After his disastrous weight cut on UFC 279 fight week, there's a real chance that Borza's future as welterweight may be uncertain. If Dana White and the UFC do decide to make a middleweight out of Kamzat, you never know how quickly he might get his shot at the belt. If Israel Adesanya is not ready, and for some reason Robert Whittaker isn't an option, do you honestly think that Dana wouldn't jump at the idea of setting up Alex Pereira for a title defense against the Chechen Wolf? Not only would this one be incredibly interesting stylistic pairing, but both men have very clear paths to victory that could make things very interesting. Kamzat can be hit, and no one at 185 pound hits harder than Poe at 10, but in saying that, Pereira's ground game is no match for Chimaev's. This one would likely be a very interesting and very short matchup. Let's keep our fingers crossed. Sean O'Malley vs Marlon Vera. This rematch needs to happen. Not only are Sean O'Malley and Marlon Cheeto Vera two of the most exciting fighters in the bantamweight division today, but both very clearly need one more big win to carve out a shot at the title for themselves. These two guys have some pretty heated history, an unresolved past if you will. Vera managed to score a TKO victory over O'Malley the first time they met, but the fact that a leg injury caused by his calf kicks were the reason for this has never fully sat well with Sugar Sean. O'Malley, in his mind, lost that fight on the back of bad luck, and in his own words, a rematch would not play out the same, not at all. But in the time since, Vera has been on a total tear ever since then, losing only to Jose Aldo while beating some of the very best of the best at 135 pounds. Both guys want it, the division needs it, and the fans would likely love seeing these two rivals run it back. Your move, Dana. Amanda Nunes vs Valentina Shevchenko. Amanda Nunes' loss to Juliana Pena and Valentina Shevchenko's closely fought victory over Talia Santos has made it clear that these greats are not going to be around forever. But as things stand, both women have successfully held on to their titles, rightfully occupying positions as the number 1 and 2 in the world. 2023 has to be the year that we finally see the third and final fight between these two, the contest for all-time great status. When they last fought, Shevchenko had not yet come into her prime as 125-pounder, and in the 5 years that have passed since then, it's pretty clear that both champions have improved enormously. Too often in MMA history, we've watched as super fights like this one fell out of reach before its time. When it comes to the battle for women's GOAT honors, the promotion would be foolish to let it slip. Justin Gaethje vs Raphael. You guys want to see an all-out slugfest? Well, if the UFC make the wise decision of setting up these two absolute hammers, chances are that the 2023 Fight of the Year discussion will be settled by the time they're through. Justin Gaethje is of course just as reliable a brawler as the sport has ever known. A true wildman in the cage whose level of pace and attrition makes his fights a uniquely chaotic spectacle. On the other hand, Raphael, perhaps out of all of his lightweight contemporaries, looks to have the power, grit, and cardio to out-Gaethje Gaethje. His war with Brad Riddell showed just how dogged his battles can become in there, and even though Gaethje has more than enough punching power to keep Fiziev at bay, in reality, this fight will likely boil down to a question of who wants it more. Stick this fight on any major UFC pay-per-view and you're all but certain to drive fan interest. They could even make it a full 5 rounds if they really wanted to ramp up the tension, but judging off the recent string of wild lightweight contender fights of late, there might be no need. Alexander Volkanovski vs Dustin Poirier. This next one requires a few different pieces to fall into place for it to work. But suppose that Alexander Volkanovski does prove successful in his attempt to become a two-weight world champion. Why not attempt to capitalize on the new champ's growing popularity with an electric matchup between him and the always reliable Dustin Poirier? The Diamond just managed to see off Michael Chandler in a scrap for the ages, putting himself in a solid position for a title shot. And though the pound-for-pound king Volkanovski has a featherweight title to worry about as well, chances are, like the most double champions, he will eventually leave one division in favor of the other. As a former welterweight, it's not like Volk is going to have much trouble with the physicality of the lightweight division, and as a former featherweight himself, Dustin Poirier will no doubt be the perfect test of Volkanovski's long-time suitability for the weight class. All that remains now is for the 145-pound king to get the better of Islam Makhachev, which is obviously easier said than done. Aljamain Sterling vs Henry Cejudo. One fight that looks pretty certain to take place at one point or another next year is Henry Cejudo versus the champion of the bantamweight division. If all goes to plan for Aljamain Sterling over the coming months, he may well get the chance to welcome Triple C back to the sport he exited dramatically a couple of years back. Does Henry actually deserve an immediate title shot? Well, your mileage may vary on that, but there's no denying how impressive Cejudo was looking just before he retired. And in a matchup against Sterling, it's pretty clear that the both men have reasonable routes to victory. Aljo is just about as strong a grappler as the bantamweight division has right now, a man capable of giving even the great Peter Yan a very tough night out. But Cejudo has Olympic level of wrestling and a very serviceable striking game to go with it. The 135-pound division has no shortage of eligible contenders right now, but to the champion's credit, after his narrow defeat of Yan and the total farce that was his defense against TJ Dillashaw, he really could use a break. And the idea of taking on a much smaller and potentially ring-rusted big name like Cejudo, yeah, that seems like the right move, doesn't it? Michael Chandler vs Conor McGregor. Next up, we have the fight that will likely bring in the biggest pay-per-view numbers of 2023, provided that it does in fact go ahead. Win, lose or draw, Conor McGregor fights always bring fireworks. Finding any degree of consistency with his performances has been tough for him in recent times, but to his defense, the Donald Cerrone fight aside, he has been stepping in there with the very best of the best in the lightweight division today. The simple fact of the matter is that Conor desperately needs to find his way back into the win column. It's not like his career will be totally finished if he does lose next time around, but it's clear that the UFC would be wise to try and set him up with a fighter that has the perfect combination of name value and legit talent. Enter Michael Chandler. For a while, it seemed as though Raphael dos Anjos would finally get his shot at his old rival McGregor after the original UFC 196 bout back in 2016 fell apart. But in recent times, Dana White has all but confirmed that Michael Chandler will be the man to get his red panty night next. And in our eyes, it's one hell of a fight. Not only does Michael Chandler have the verbal skills to hold his own in there with the biggest star in the sport, but in the cage, there's next to no chance that this fight turns out to be anything less than a barn burner. Francis Ngannou vs Jon Jones. And finally, we have come to a matchup that could serve as one of the defining fights of the era. Hell, the heavyweight clash between Francis Ngannou and Jon Jones may well be one of the biggest fights of all time. Ngannou has proven his doubters wrong time and time again, developing a well-rounded game to complement his immense power. These days, he's far more reliable champion than most people ever expected, and his punching power has only grown as his overall skill set developed. The major question here is whether one of the greatest fighters of all time in Jon Jones can cause his technical mastery to move up in weight and somehow get around by far and away the hardest puncher in the sport has ever known. This is a type of fight that only comes around once every few years, a true super fight that could well outperform even the most lofty box office predictions. Ngannou vs Jones is just about as good as it's ever going to get in the UFC, and for our money, it's looking set to be 2023's most amazing UFC fight. If Jones is in fact successful in joining that exclusive group of double champions, his overall GOAT status argument will go from very strong to damn nearly undisputable. The stakes have never been higher, and with a puncher like Ngannou in front of him, neither have the danger levels. But what fight are you most excited for in 2023, and how do you think we did with our picks? Be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. As always, thanks for tuning in.